Hi, this is Grandpa. I'm talking to you from the Alaska wilderness. I've been here for 2 months in my RV. This is August of 2023, and it's raining too hard outside, so I'm going to do it inside the trailer. So I hope it works all right for you. I was fortunate enough to work in Montana at Glacier National Park while I was going to college in the summers. 1966 was my third and last summer. I met your grandmother about 8 months later, and we were married in June of 1967. Poor Grandma heard this story many times, and the kids have heard this story, but I want you to be able to share it with your children. Also makes a good story sometimes around the campfire. In 1966, I was a bellman at the Many Glacier Hotel, and I loved to fish on my day off. We only got one day at a time, so there were no overnighters. I had to go out early in the morning, come back at night. And my location of choice was a place called Lake Elizabeth, which was a very remote wilderness lake, about a 10-mile hike, a strenuous hike at that, from the hotel. And so I left early in the morning, and then I would come back, hopefully before dark. When I left the hotel, I had to sign out, tell them where I was going and when I'd be back, and if I was going with anybody. And then when I returned, I would sign in, and nobody would come looking for me. And that was the plan. I signed out early in the morning, and I had a sack lunch waiting for me in the kitchen of the hotel. It was a sandwich, an apple, and a cookie, as I believe, but that was my lunch. And I had a World War II surplus canteen of water. We didn't have bottled water back then. No cell phones, no firearms, no bear spray. Had none of that stuff. Just our wits, I suppose. It was also 60 years ago, so there was no backcountry permits required. None of that stuff. It was a different time. You could go on a hike like that and not see a living soul. I don't think that's true today. I think the park is overcrowded with tourists in the summer. So anyway, I left and I hiked over to the lake. It took me about 4 hours, as I recall. Very strenuous hike. But you go up past Iceberg Lake, which is behind Swift Current Motor Lodge. It too is a fairly strenuous hike, but Iceberg Lake is aptly named. It's normally has little icebergs, little chunks of ice and snow float. It's not a big lake, but floating in it. Now, it was like that then. I don't know that that's the case today, but it might still be. And then from Iceberg Lake to the Ptarmigan Tunnel is a very strenuous hike. Not a very long distance, but a very steep climb. When you get to the Ptarmigan Tunnel, it's about a 250-foot tunnel, as I recall, built in 1930 to aid hikers in getting to the other side, saving a very dangerous climb over the Ptarmigan Wall. And you can almost stand up. As I recall, I could almost stand up. I'm about 6 feet tall, and I think I had to duck just a little. And on either end of the tunnel is a big steel door, which they lock, though the rangers come up and lock it in the fall before the snow comes. Keep the animals out. It'd be a great place for them to hibernate. When you walk through the tunnel, on the other side is this glorious view of the Belly River Valley and Lake Elizabeth at the bottom. It's kind of scary. You look off to your left as you start down into the valley. It's a very steep drop-off. And then to your right, it's a treeless slope going up to the top of the mountain. So this part of the trail is without trees. Anyway, I hiked down this trail to the foot of the lake, and that's where the water runs out of the lake into the Belly River. You had to cross a creek, wade across a creek, and I think now there's a little bridge. And then you turn and you walk up the left side. As you can see, the far side of the lake has trees, very thick timber. and it's a little over a mile, and you walk up there, and then you get to the other end of the lake, which is the head of the lake, and there's a campground used by the wranglers, the horsemen, when they took tourists up for an overnight stay. And then I walked about another 300 yards from there to where the creek ran into the lake. That's where I fished. I fished on a little sandbar going out in the lake at where the water came in. And I had a self-timer thing in my head about how long I could fish and when I had to leave, because it was a good 4-hour hike at least, and I didn't want to do it in the dark. So I had my self-timer on, and I had a watch. And I'd keep checking my watch, and I was doing good. And all of a sudden, the sun went down behind the mountain. And it gets noticeably cooler and noticeably dimmer the instant the sun goes down. And I looked at my watch, and my watch was the same time. Well, my watch had quit working. So I don't know what time it was, but I knew it was past time to leave. And so I quickly put everything in my little backpack, my fishing pole, and I think I had some fish in a plastic bag, and waded across the creek, stepped up on the bank, and I must have stepped on a branch that snapped when I stepped on it, and it sounded like a .22 rifle had gone off. It was so quiet in this enormous valley that this was a loud noise. Well, it turns out there was a grizzly bear about 20 yards from me, and for some reason he had no idea I was there. The wind must have been just perfect, and of course I didn't know he was there. And I say he, I don't know the sex of the bear, but there were no cubs, so we can assume perhaps it was a he. And the bear took off running up into that horse campground, 100 yards or 200 yards away. And I waved my arms and yelling, hey bear, and go away bear, and all that stuff. And the bear went up in the campground, and he stood up on his hind legs and woofed and sniffed. And it wasn't long before he came down on all fours and started to lumber towards me. And I just remember, I don't remember the fear. I'm sure there was a lot of fear. I either could jump in the lake, which a few hours earlier was a glacier, so it was very cold, or I could find a tree. Well, there was a tree. It was a leaning tree. It was a dead tree. It was 45-degree angles. It was perfect. It was, I think somebody up above was looking out after me. I could never have climbed a pine tree straight up, so I would have been in some real difficulty. But this tree was for me, so I left my stuff on the ground and I scrambled up this tree as fast as I could. I remember I tore the inside of my jeans and my inside of my legs with the stubs sticking out of that tree. It had been there for years and years and years. So I knew when I got to the top, I could very well knock that tree out of the tree that was holding it, and it would put me on the ground, and I would have some real problems at that point. Didn't happen. I'm at the top. Now this is a grizzly bear the grizzly bears can climb trees. They certainly could climb this one. He could have pushed the tree down. He could have, if he had wanted me for dinner, he could have easily done it. Instead, he chose to walk around the bottom of the tree and make funny noises and sniff and grunt and stuff like that. And it seems like it was for a couple hours that he did that. I think it was probably closer to 15 minutes. And he left. And he disappeared into the timber. Well, I knew I couldn't stay in that tree all night. That wasn't gonna happen. So I thought, well, the bear maybe is going to sit in the timber and want to get me. But I had no choice, I didn't think. So I finally got enough nerve to come out of the tree. I got down to the bottom and I took the fish out of my backpack that were in a bag and left them on the ground, and grabbed my backpack that had the remnants of my lunch and my fishing pole and a few fishing lures, and I took off. and it was getting dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. It's surprisingly how quickly it gets dark in a canyon like that. And I sang Jingle Bells. This is what tickled Grandma. I sang Jingle Bells as loud as I could. That's the only song I could think of. And I sang it over and over and over again as loud as I could, so the bear would hear me coming and hopefully take off. So I really was frightened as I walked through the trees. Very, very thick timber with a very narrow trail, but it was uneventful. I got through the timber, I waded through the creek at the foot of the lake, and then started that long upward climb to the tunnel, and a very steep drop off then to my right. And it's getting darker and darker and darker, and about halfway up the trail, it was so dark. I don't think I could see the hand in front of my face. It was that dark. It probably like it is on the ocean in a boat with no lights, just the definition of dark. And it was dark. And I knew there was a cliff on one side, and animals love trails. I figured, well, there could be a bear on the trail at night. They come out at night. I just needed to get to the tunnel. And I thought, well, God, maybe there's a. And then I thought, well, maybe there's a bear in the tunnel, So I shuffled my feet. I remember that. I'm still singing Jingle Bells. I'm shuffling my feet so I can feel the trail. And by some grace, I made it to the tunnel. And I yelled and I threw some rocks in the tunnel, hoping that if there was anything in there, they would get out. And then I took a deep breath and I walked through the tunnel. And I got to the other side of the tunnel, which was the Swift Current Valley, and I could see the lights of the motel and the hotel, actually. The hotel was probably 4 or 5 miles as the crow flies. And the motel was at the bottom, probably a couple of miles. And I knew I wasn't out of the woods yet. There were bear issues on that side of the pass as well. And it's also a steep trail. It's not as treacherous as the one I just came over, but I had to be very careful. And I made it. It was uneventful. There were no animals. There was nothing that even jumped out and scared me. So I made it down to the bottom. It was pitch black. I don't know what time it was. I'm guessing 11 o'clock, maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock. And now it's not as dark because there are lights at the campground and lights at the motel. And I go to the ranger's house. I knew the ranger. We'd known each other for the 3 years that I was there. We weren't friends, but I knew him. Knocked on his door, and he was up. And I told him the story, and he said, well, there had been a problem bear on that trail last couple of weeks. They even closed it for a day. I didn't know that. They closed the trail one day a week or so ago for a bear problem. He gave me a ride down to the hotel and said to come back the next day when I had time and just to fill out a report. And when I got to the hotel, I knew the people who were working there, or some of them anyway, and I signed in. And I made it back, and they asked me about my day, and I told them the story as best I could. And I went to bed, and that was the end of it. The kicker to the story is 60 some years later, my son Aaron called me one day and said he was at a gun shop in Murrieta and was talking to the guy behind the counter about things, and somehow they ended up talking about my bear story and my years at Many Glacier. And the guy said, well, you know what, I was in Many Glacier that year. And he said, I remember working in the front office that night when the ranger came and dropped this guy off, who came in and proceeded to tell his friends about his bear trip. Now that was an incredible thing. That was mean, you talk about a small world. Here's a guy that I don't even know who it was. Aaron told me, and I didn't know the guy. But he was there the night that the Ranger pickup brought me around to the hotel and dropped me off. Fitting into a story that could have had a much different ending. I could have disappeared into the wilderness and never been seen or heard of again. I'm fortunate. I'm still here, and I'm still enjoying every bit of the wilderness. And the Alaska wilderness, where I am right now, is very special. I'm very lucky at my age. I'm 78 years old to be able to do this. Hopefully, I'll be able to do it again. Hopefully, you'll have good times. Hopefully, you'll be able to go in the wilderness if you want to. And maybe you can tell this story about your grandpa around a campfire. Good night.